If you rely on Section 8 as a senior, here is a question you should not ignore. What if the program you count on isn't being cut, but quietly changed in ways that could affect your housing security without you ever getting a warning? Before we dive into the hidden shifts reshaping housing assistance, make sure to hit that subscribe button for Tax Hack Pro. We break down the government policies and financial changes that affect your stability and your wallet. Section 8 still exists, but the rules around it, the funding behind it, and the way support is prioritized are shifting. And those changes matter far more for seniors than most people realize. Why are waitlists getting longer even when demand hasn't slowed? Why does it feel harder to move or protect a voucher than it used to? And why are some benefits improving quietly while others are becoming harder to reach? These aren't random problems, and they aren't happening by accident. They are signs of major changes inside the Section 8 system, changes that could determine who stays protected and who gets left vulnerable. If you are a senior, understanding these changes now could make the difference between keeping your stability and losing it when it is hardest to recover. Number 1. Possible time limits. 2 years on Section 8. What would you do if the housing assistance you have depended on for years suddenly came with a countdown clock, quietly moving toward an end date you never expected? That question is no longer hypothetical. At the federal level, policymakers are increasingly pushing the idea of imposing a maximum 2-year limit on Section 8 vouchers in public housing, arguing that it would encourage self-sufficiency. On paper, that may sound reasonable. In real life, especially for seniors, it plays out very differently. This shift didn't happen by accident. Rising housing costs, tightening federal budgets, and growing pressure to cut long-term spending have collided. This has led to a mindset in Washington that housing assistance should be temporary, not permanent. The problem is that Section 8 was never designed as a short bridge for people expected to quickly move on. It was built as long-term protection for those with extremely low incomes, including seniors and people with disabilities. Research from New York University warns that more than 1.4 million households could lose housing assistance if strict time limits like this are enforced. And many would have no realistic place to turn. For seniors, this proposal cuts straight into daily reality. There is no next step back into the workforce for someone in their 70s living on Social Security or SSI. There is no sudden income increase waiting to offset the loss. A 2-year limit doesn't create independence. It introduces instability into lives that depend most on predictability. If this proposal were to become law, Section 8 would no longer function as the long-term safety net seniors were promised. It would function as a temporary benefit with an expiration date, quietly changing how secure housing feels in the years ahead. What is troubling is that even before any law changes, the conversation alone is already reshaping how the system operates. When housing agencies sense that Section 8 may face future limits, they become more cautious, more rigid, and less flexible in how they manage the program. Decisions once handled with discretion and understanding are increasingly replaced by stricter procedures, because no agency wants to expand a program whose long-term funding feels uncertain. For seniors, this doesn't arrive as a sudden shock. It arrives as a slow-building sense of unease. You may never receive a letter saying, "Your voucher will end in 2 years," yet you feel it in small ways. Moving becomes harder. Exceptions are scrutinized more closely. Recertifications feel more stressful. Each change is subtle on its own, but together they steadily wear down the feeling of security. Put yourself in the place of an older adult who has built a stable life around Section 8. Their world is balanced on a fragile reality, fixed income, controlled rent, and the belief that they won't be forced out simply because the market shifts. When the idea of time limits enters the picture, that belief starts to crack, not because the law has changed, but because the future no longer feels certain. This is especially dangerous because seniors don't have many backup options. Younger people can switch jobs, relocate, share housing, or live temporarily while waiting for another opportunity. For older adults, every move carries physical and emotional strain. Leaving familiar surroundings, trusted doctors, established routines, and community support can have consequences far deeper than anything reflected in a policy memo. There is also a quieter impact that is rarely discussed. The psychological pressure of a countdown clock often begins long before it officially exists. Once people start believing their housing assistance may no longer be permanent, they shift into defensive mode. They delay repairs. They avoid drawing attention to their situation. They hesitate to ask for help. They live cautiously. Over time, that constant vigilance erodes quality of life. Most importantly, the 2-year limit proposal signals a deeper shift in how policy views those it serves. Instead of seeing seniors as people needing long-term protection, the system begins treating them as cases meant to transition, even when no realistic destination exists. For older adults, this isn't just a policy change. It is a disconnect between written rules and lived reality. This is not a moment for panic, but it is not a moment for complacency either. When ideas like time limits surface repeatedly in policy discussions, it is a sign the foundation of the program is moving. Understanding that early allows seniors to prepare, stay informed at the local level, and avoid being caught off guard if today's quiet proposals become tomorrow's binding rules. If you want to stay ahead of these policy shifts before they hit your mailbox, make sure you subscribe to Tax Hack Pro. We monitor these changes so you don't have to navigate them alone. Number 2. Section 8 is no longer the top funding priority. What if the real danger to Section 8 isn't a sudden cut, but the quiet realization that the money simply isn't flowing there anymore? That question matters more than most seniors realize, because while Section 8 still exists on paper, federal housing dollars are increasingly being redirected elsewhere. And that shift is already reshaping how secure long-term housing feels. Over the past year, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development announced more than $1.1 billion in new housing funding. But much of that money is not going to traditional Section 8 vouchers. Instead, it is being steered toward temporary and transitional housing programs, short-term solutions designed to move people through the system rather than keep them stably housed for years. On the surface, this looks like progress, more programs, more initiatives, more headlines about new funding, but underneath, the priorities have shifted. This change didn't happen overnight. Federal housing budgets are under pressure. Homelessness numbers are rising, and policymakers are being pushed to show quick results. Temporary housing programs look efficient on paper. They promise turnover, visible outcomes, and faster movement. Section 8, by contrast, is quiet. It doesn't create dramatic before and after stories. It keeps people housed year after year, which is exactly why it has worked so well for seniors, but also why it is becoming less attractive in a political environment focused on short-term metrics. The problem is that housing stability doesn't work the same way for everyone. For a younger adult in crisis, a transitional program might be a stepping stone. For a senior living on a fixed income, stability isn't a phase, it is the goal. Section 8 was designed with that reality in mind. It wasn't meant to shuffle people along. It was meant to anchor them. When funding shifts away from long-term assistance, that anchor starts to feel lighter. You can already see the effects without reading a single budget document. Seniors report longer waitlists, fewer new vouchers opening up, and less flexibility when it comes to moving or adjusting housing situations. Housing authorities, aware that long-term funding is tighter, become more cautious. Every decision feels heavier. Every exception feels harder to justify. Nothing is officially cut, but everything feels more constrained. For older adults, this creates a kind of slow instability, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that shows up in daily decisions. Should you move closer to a doctor if it risks losing your voucher? Should you report a change if it might complicate recertification? Should you plan for the long term when the system itself seems focused on short-term solutions? These are not abstract policy questions. They are the calculations seniors are already making quietly. And here is the part that is easy to miss. Once funding priorities change, they are hard to reverse. Programs that lose momentum don't disappear all at once. They fade. Expansion stalls, openings become rare, access tightens. By the time people realize what is happening, the safety net hasn't snapped. It is simply thinned. That is why this shift matters so much for seniors. Section 8 isn't being attacked loudly. It is being outpaced quietly. And understanding that now gives you context for everything else you are seeing, from longer waits to fewer options. The question isn't whether Section 8 still exists. The real question is whether it is still being treated as the long-term lifeline it was always meant to be, or whether it is slowly being pushed aside in a system that is moving on without the people who depend on it most. Number 3, longer waitlists and fewer new vouchers. The pressure on Section 8 is no longer theoretical. It is becoming visible through longer waitlists and fewer new vouchers entering the system. As Congress and federal agencies debate housing budgets for 2025 and 2026, the focus is shifting away from expanding rental assistance and toward simply keeping existing programs afloat. In many proposals, funding for Section 8 is not increasing in line with rising rents, and in some cases, it isn't increasing at all. That gap alone is enough to quietly change how the program works on the ground. When rent prices rise but funding stays flat, housing authorities are forced to make difficult choices. Most are prioritizing the preservation of existing vouchers rather than issuing new ones. On paper, this looks like fiscal responsibility. In reality, it means fewer opportunities for new applicants and significantly longer waits for those already in line. Some agencies are closing their waitlists entirely. Not because demand has disappeared, but because they know they can't afford to help anyone new. For seniors waiting for Section 8, time is not a neutral factor. Longer waitlists mean staying longer in housing that may already be unstable or unaffordable. It can mean paying a growing share of a fixed Social Security or SSI check toward rent, leaving less room for food, utilities, or medical expenses. It can also mean postponing moves that would make life safer, such as relocating closer to doctors, caregivers, or family support. Even seniors who already have vouchers are not immune to this tightening. When budgets are strained, housing authorities become more cautious about reissuing vouchers if someone leaves the program, moves to a new unit, or experiences a disruption in eligibility. Losing a voucher, even temporarily, can mean waiting months or longer to get back in. In a system focused on maintaining current numbers rather than expanding access, there may be no replacement voucher available. This creates a quiet form of instability. Seniors may avoid moving even when their housing no longer meets their needs because they fear triggering a review or losing assistance. Others may feel pressure to accept housing that isn't ideal simply to remain within the program. The safety net still exists, but it feels narrower, less flexible, and far less forgiving than before. What makes this shift especially difficult is how silently it happens. There is no clear announcement saying that waitlists will grow or that vouchers will become scarce. Instead, applications go unanswered, openings stop appearing, and progress slows without explanation. For retirees living on fixed incomes, this erosion of access increases both financial strain and emotional uncertainty. This is the real impact of nationwide budget tightening. Section 8 hasn't vanished, but the path into it is longer and more competitive, and the margin for mistakes is smaller. For seniors, recognizing this shift early is essential, not because it offers an easy fix, but because it explains why the system feels different now, and why relying on patience alone may no longer be enough to protect long-term housing stability. Number 4, risk of losing vouchers due to budget shortfalls. One of the biggest risks facing Section 8 right now doesn't come from a change in the law. It comes from something much quieter: not enough funding. Even if Section 8 rules remain untouched, the total number of people who can be helped can still shrink over time. Budget watchdog groups warn that when renewal funding falls short, HUD may allow vouchers to disappear through attrition, meaning they are not reissued when someone leaves the program. What makes this especially troubling is how invisible the process is. There is no public notice saying vouchers are being cut, no major headlines. Someone moves, passes away, or exits the program for any reason, and that voucher simply isn't replaced because the money isn't there. Analysts estimate that roughly 100,000 to 180,000 vouchers nationwide could disappear this way, not because of a clear policy decision, but because funding doesn't stretch far enough to renew them. For seniors, this hits harder than it sounds. Section 8 has always been difficult to access, but it once operated on the assumption that vouchers, once created, would continue circulating in the system. Attrition breaks that assumption. Every lost voucher permanently shrinks the pool, while demand from older adults continues to grow. The system doesn't collapse overnight. It slowly tightens. Even seniors who currently receive assistance aren't completely protected. When vouchers become scarce, housing authorities grow more cautious about reissuing them after disruptions. A move, a temporary loss of eligibility, or a short break from the program can carry far more risk than before. Losing a voucher, even briefly, may mean waiting a very long time to get back in simply because there may be no replacement available. The most dangerous part of attrition is that it doesn't feel like a crisis at first. It unfolds quietly over time and is often only recognized after access has already narrowed significantly. For older adults, the key message isn't panic, it is awareness. Section 8 doesn't need to be officially cut to become harder to reach. Funding shortfalls alone can reduce opportunities, limit second chances, and make the path to housing stability much narrower. Even when the program looks unchanged on the surface. If you are finding this information helpful, consider subscribing to Tax Hack Pro. We dig deep into these funding issues to give you the real picture. Number 5. New income and asset calculation rules starting January 1st, 2026. Not every change happening to Section 8 is bad news, and this is one area where seniors may quietly benefit if they understand what is changing. Starting January 1st, 2026, HUD is updating how income and assets are calculated when determining eligibility and rent contributions. These are technical changes, not headline-grabbing reforms. But for older adults living on fixed incomes, they can make a meaningful difference. For years, many seniors have felt stuck in a narrow gap. They don't earn much, but they have managed to save a small amount over a lifetime of work. Under older rules, even modest savings could be treated harshly, counted in ways that reduced assistance or pushed someone closer to losing eligibility. The new calculations are meant to better reflect inflation and modern financial reality, especially for elderly and disabled households. One key change is a higher threshold for counting assets. Seniors can now hold more in savings before HUD begins imputing income from those assets. This matters because it reduces the penalty for being careful and responsible. Having a small emergency fund, burial savings, or money set aside for medical needs is less likely to work against you than it did before. Another important adjustment is the increase in the mandatory deduction for elderly and disabled households. This deduction lowers the amount of income HUD considers when calculating rent contributions. For seniors, that can mean slightly lower rent payments or a better chance of staying within eligibility limits as costs rise elsewhere. It is not a windfall, but it can provide breathing room in a budget that already feels tight. What is important to understand is that these changes don't rewrite Section 8 itself. They don't guarantee approval. And they don't protect against broader funding cuts or voucher shortages, but they do change how the math works behind the scenes. For seniors whose income or assets sit near the margins, that math can determine whether assistance continues smoothly or becomes a source of stress. This is also where preparation matters, because these are calculation changes, not automatic benefits. Housing authorities will still rely on the information you report. Keeping documents current, understanding how assets are classified, and knowing what deductions apply can make a real difference. Two households with similar finances can end up with very different outcomes depending on how clearly and accurately their information is presented. Number 6, Section 8 can no longer be the only plan. There is a critical shift many seniors haven't fully realized yet. Section 8 is no longer the final destination it once was. It is now just one piece of a broader plan to keep your housing secure, not because the program is about to disappear, but because everything around it has become more fragile, slower, and far less forgiving when something goes wrong. In that reality, relying on Section 8 alone has become a real risk. In the past, the path was clear. You applied, you waited your turn, and once you had a voucher, your life could be built around that stability. Section 8 was strong enough to stand on its own. Today, that is no longer true. Waitlists stretch on for years. Fewer new vouchers are available. Renewals are less predictable. And slipping out of the system even once can mean you are locked out for a very long time. That is what makes Section 8 unreliable as a single, standalone plan. The core issue is timing. Section 8 may arrive too late or not arrive at the moment you need it most. Seniors don't have the luxury of waiting years in unsafe, unaffordable, or physically unsuitable housing. And if you fall out of the program for any reason, today's system offers no guarantee that you will be able to get back in quickly. Without a backup plan, that gap can turn into a crisis overnight. So when we say Section 8 can no longer be the only plan, we are not talking about walking away from it. We are talking about refusing to put your entire sense of security behind a single door. Seniors now need to think in layers: state and local rental assistance, senior-specific housing programs, HUD VASH for veterans, supportive housing, or medical-based assistance when health needs are involved. None of these options are perfect on their own, but together they create a buffer. The biggest change here isn't policy. It is mindset. The era of just wait for Section 8 and everything will be fine is over. In today's environment, those who understand early that Section 8 is only one part of the plan are far more likely to stay stable, even as the system continues to shift quietly around them. Number 7. Local housing authorities matter more than ever. There is a truth many seniors haven't fully realized yet. Section 8 may be a federal program, but your outcome is decided locally. The law itself might not change. But how it is applied, how waitlists are managed, and how flexible your voucher is all depend on your local housing authority. And when budgets are tight, that local discretion becomes even more powerful. Ask yourself this: if you need to move closer to your doctor, will your housing authority see that as a legitimate need or as a risk they would rather avoid? If your file is missing one small document, will they give you time to fix it or let your application sit indefinitely? And if your voucher is disrupted, who decides whether you get back in quickly or end up starting over at the back of the line? When resources are plentiful, systems can afford flexibility. When funding is strained, local housing authorities are forced to be more selective, more cautious, and sometimes far more rigid. These decisions don't make headlines, but they directly shape the lives of seniors relying on Section 8. Two seniors with the same income and eligibility can have completely different outcomes simply because they live in different jurisdictions. This is why wait and see is no longer a safe strategy. Seniors need to understand how their local housing authority operates, what it prioritizes, and what kinds of issues can quietly delay or derail a case. In today's environment, knowing where you stand in the system can matter just as much as having a voucher at all. The message here is simple but serious. If you don't pay attention to what is happening locally, you are leaving your housing security to decisions made behind closed doors. And that is a risk seniors shouldn't have to take in a system that is changing quietly but steadily every single day. Section 8 isn't disappearing, but it is changing in ways that matter deeply for seniors. The safety net that once felt solid is now thinner, slower, and less predictable, shaped by tighter budgets, shifting priorities, and quiet decisions made at the local level. That doesn't mean help is gone, but it does mean staying passive is no longer enough. The seniors who protect their housing in the years ahead will be the ones who stay informed, prepare early, and understand how the system actually works today, not how it worked a decade ago. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture more clearly, take a moment to like this video. Subscribe to Tax Hack Pro so you don't miss the financial news that affects your life. The more people understand these changes now, the fewer will be caught off guard later when stability is hardest to rebuild. I'm the Tax Hack Pro. Protect your housing, protect your future, and I'll see you in the next video.